We're coming to you live from Jerusalem while Israel battles rockets and tunnels from Hamas. There's a new warning from a top U.S. military official against eliminating the group that the U.S. government has officially sanctioned as a terrorist organization. CNN's Brian Todd has more. He's joining us from Washington. Brian, tell our viewers what's going on.
Wolf, those warnings being sounded tonight because that military intelligence official and analyst we spoke to say there are elements inside Gaza which are worse than Hamas. They're more radical. They're more violent. One of them is the group that has wreaked havoc in Iraq and Syria recently with a series of vicious battles and grotesque treatment of its enemies. Now, we have to warn you, some viewers might find some images in this story disturbing. Israel pushes on, destroying Hamas tunnels, degrading the group's firepower amid calls to go even further. Former Israeli ambassador to the U.S. Michael Oren says, quote, Israel must be permitted to crush Hamas. But if Hamas was wiped out, who would fill the void? The Pentagon's top intelligence officer said the threat could grow even greater in an interview with CNN's Evan Perez.
There are other things there that behind Hamas, if Hamas gets out of the way, that perhaps could be worse.
We would probably end up with something much worse. Something like an ISIS or an ISIL.
ISIS, ISIL, now calling itself the Islamic State. Three names for the same group. Radical Islamist fighters who've now taken over much of Iraq. So brutal they've been disowned by al-Qaeda. They just overran an army base in Syria. Video of the aftermath of that battle purports to show the severed heads of Islamic State victims impaled on poles in the city of Raqqa. CNN cannot independently verify the authenticity of the video. Could this play out in Gaza? Experts say there are elements of the Islamic State in Gaza, along with other groups more extreme than Hamas.
If Hamas was somehow destroyed and nothing was left in its place, you had a vacuum, you could have a situation where the most militant elements from Hamas, from Islamic Jihad, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, from these smaller Salafi jihadi groups could somehow band together into something more radical.
But analysts say it's not likely the so-called Islamic State would actually take over Gaza. They're too small in number, not well coordinated there. So how far will Israel go with Hamas?
I think it's important to deal Hamas a decisive blow, not necessarily replacing it, and then demilitarize Hamas so that you have a defanged Hamas running Gaza.
But could a defanged Hamas be someday overrun by ISIS, that Islamic State, or other more militant groups who might eventually gather steam in Gaza? Analyst Matthew Levitt says Hamas would still probably have a lot of political and social power in Gaza, having run schools, hospitals, and other civil services. But, Wolf, it's an open question tonight. If Hamas is wiped out there, some of these groups could gain some steam eventually.
Brian Todd, thanks very much. Joining us now, the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Mike Rogers. Mr. Chairman, thanks very much for joining. Do you agree with the Defense Intelligence Agency head who says, as bad as Hamas might be, it could be a whole lot worse?
Well, candidly, I just don't even understand the context of that, Wolf. Think about what they're doing. They have been militarizing the Gaza Strip for really more than a decade. In the last few years have been obtaining advanced missile systems, some that they make internally, but some from external. Some believe it's from Iran. And they're firing these at civilian populations. It's hard to argue that you can get worse than that. Thankfully, the Iron Dome has been effective, and I think the counteroffensive of that with the Israelis has been effective. You cannot go into this thinking we're going to allow one terrorist organization to freely operate because there might be another one that's worse. I think that is a loser from the start. I think what they need to do is demilitarize the Gaza Strip. And part of that means that you have to deal a decisive blow to Hamas and its military wing. Period, pure and simple. Palestinian Authority can fill in. Other organizations that could provide governance could fill in. But when you say don't go too far in destroying a terrorist organization, boy, that really concerns me that maybe they don't fully understand the sophistication of Hamas and who its allies are in Iran and other places.
Because the Israeli government says their ultimate goal is a demilitarized Gaza Strip. Here's the question. Can that be achieved through diplomatic, political means, or can it only be achieved, as some here, some hardliners in Israel, suggest, through military means?
Well, you never, ever want to give up on the diplomatic solution. But the problem is they've had plenty of opportunities to do that. Think of all the money that they should have spent on getting people connected to water in the Gaza Strip. 20% of the population there isn't even connected to a water source. 90% of the water that they get is not up to Western standards, even close. All of the money that went there, a lot of that money went into tunnels, missiles, and weapon systems. It just doesn't seem that they want that part of the equation. I don't know. I think it's very, very difficult. I think in order to get them to negotiate, you have to damage the military wing of Hamas to the point where they're willing to sit down and talk about demilitarization. If you don't do that, they're not going to give up their rockets. They're not going to give up their weapons. We've seen that in 2006. We've seen that in other incursions, especially into between Gaza and Israel. I just don't see it that way. I think we're going to have a decisive military victory in order to get them to negotiate to a better place.
So when the Obama administration tells the Israeli government of Prime Minister Netanyahu, go ahead and accept an immediate ceasefire, unconditional ceasefire, a lot of Israelis say they don't want to do that right now because they want to finish what they see as a threat to Israel. You say...
I say that's right. You shouldn't ask Israel to give up on what they know is certainly counter-tunneling, and you did a phenomenal job today of pointing out the sophistication of those tunnels. I think there are over 35 now that the Israelis have found and are trying to deal with. The sophistication of that. They need to continue with that detunneling or that counter-tunnel kind of operation in order to have a secure border. At the same time, there are certain logistics centers for the manufacture of these missiles that they know and have been able to locate through good intelligence. They ought to have the ability to dismantle those. An immediate ceasefire without having the ability to continue on the counter-tunneling, I think, is a serious mistake, and that's why Israel won't take it. I don't even know why they have that discussion, just like there needs humanitarian aid, which should be let in to Gaza under certain conditions. Those are the two ways you can get to an agreement. This notion that you have to just stop doing what you're doing when over 2,000 missiles have landed or been fired into Israel, it doesn't meet the reality on the ground and the threat that Israel is under right now.
Mike Rogers is the chairman of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, thanks very much for joining us.
Hey, thanks, Wolf. Be safe.